So quickly repeat myself for those of us online. This is the second panel on seeing the world of food in a new way, rethinking food and EU law and governance. As we talked about this morning, to truly challenge the myriad of crises that we're tackling with the food system, we would need alternative visions and alternative framings of food and EU law. So in this panel, we're talking about to which extent EU law allows for such alternative framings. Does it pay attention to, for instance, the rights of animals and nature in the food system? Which knowledge and worldviews inform the EU transition, which are marginalized? And how can EU law and governance truly rethink the meaning of food? So I'm delighted to present to you our speakers for today. On my left, first have Elisabet Nadeu, from the Institute for European Environmental Policy. Next up, we have Anniek, who is a professor in health and law here at the UvA, with Alessandra Arcuri, who is a professor at the Erasmus University of Rotterdam. And then lastly, but certainly not least, Camilla Björkbom, who is from the Eurogroup for animals. Alessandra, do you want to take it away?
Yes. Can you put the PowerPoint?
Yes.
And how do I change?
Yeah.
That was do it like this. Okay, so thanks a lot for the invitation, Maria, and for the organization of this wonderful program. And also, I'm so delighted to be in an all-women panel. That's absolutely showing how important themes are taken up by women. All right, so this is my title, Food Decommodification and Sustainability. And when I sent the title, I didn't have the word imagine. Now, why? Let me tell you something about this story. This started as one story. I was impressed and captured by some of the scientific report to the commission in which it was explicitly alluded to a move towards decommodification. So food should not be seen as a commodity if we are serious about sustainability, because it's not compatible with a sustainability focus. And I thought, okay, I'm going to observe the practice of those actors working in markets where actually food is not commodified. And when I presented this work, I talk of alternative food networks. I will tell you a bit more in a bit. But the feedback I had was a little bit of pushback. Say, okay, your story about counter-regulation, and I will tell you about counter-regulation, it's nice, but please, stop with this decommodification narrative. Maybe because I am very stubborn, I thought, no. and I think it is because I'm stubborn, but it's also because I think, okay, when I observe these practices, this is really what I see. I see decommodification. And so, of course, there is a little bit of a challenge to imagine decommodification in legal food system. And I thought, yeah, but we should live up to the challenge. And the main challenge is, I think, because we think that it's unimaginable a market that is decommodified. And so I want to help us imagine, and here it is an image of a farmer who I interviewed that goes to the market and is the proof that decommodification can happen. Let me just say one or two words on these alternative food networks. I look at a plurality of experience of producer, citizen that are part of these networks. They are typically not conceptualized or as consumer, but as co-producer, NGOs, trade union, etc. And these are also what it is called in some literature a strong form of alternative food networks. So it's not about just making food organic, but it's really about a network that is concerned about sustainability. And there are various examples, which I will talk you through. But I think these examples are the first good step to start this imagining process, to tell us why are we not able to imagine, because I think we tend to conflate so much markets with commodification. So if we think of market, you say, well, markets usually you have commodity, if you and that's it. Well, but actually that's absolutely a flawed imagination of markets. So these are typical markets where food as a commodity is not the main issue. It's really, these are markets around food where the people that produce in contact with the people that co-produce, so that eat and pay a price. So there is an exchange, yes, there is a commodity, but it's all about making it sustainable. And these markets are very social. And then I was thinking also, it was mentioned Article 3 of the TFEU. Well, there is an explicit reference to social market. The EU doesn't aim just the market, social market. So let's get serious about the fact that markets can be social. We see them, and we even have in the legal text the social market. So that's my first step of imagination. Now, of course, in the first step, there is always a counterpoint, and one of the major counter-argument is, but you are talking of the ultra-periphery. So all this experience, very nice, but they are at the margins. And then I had to think of slavery. I mean, slavery was a very important part of the economic system in the 19th century, right? Did it mean that economic system can only be slavery made? Of course not. And then I had to think of the most beautiful quote of Toni Morrison when she was interviewed about writing as an African-American Black woman, and an interviewer continued to ask, why don't you write about white people? And she won the Nobel Prize. Everybody read the book, but myself, I still have to discover her properly. But then I saw this interview actually very recently, and oh my gosh, this is so powerful. And she says in this interview, I stood at the border, stood at the edge, and claimed it as central. So I claim it as central and let the rest of the world move over where I was. So I think for, this counter argument, this is marginal. Let's make it central. I mean, it's not marginal by nature. It's not peripheral because there is a natural status of things. It is peripheral because we as society made it peripheral, these decommodified markets. All right, so few words on the more practical part, the one that is more publishable. This movement as counter-regulation. I use this term inspired by Rosan Vallon on counter-democracy. What they do, they have regulatory practice that actually are not opposite of regulation, but they do reinforce the goals of regulation. We all have in all our legal acts a goal of sustainability. Actually, we fail in achieving that, and so these movements are resisting this. But there is this antinomy here, they are countering the contingent state of agriculture, but at the same time they are realizing an alternative around one goal of both public and private regulation of sustainability. And here I want to add another line. For those of you who read the presentation, there is a few additional points here, and this is one. So I think we can think of decommodification in many ways, and one is also decommodification as decomposing. So food is not food as a system, as something that is vital for health, for culture, but it's just, this commodity. And this is this political separation, which I talked of politics of separation in the context of pesticide, because the way they are assessed, it's really compartmentalize it, looks at one substance devoid of understanding how it works in the environment and so on and so forth. Actually, it's the same logic that underpins this idea of decommodification. We cannot talk of the whole, we cannot think of the whole. We are forced to hyper-fragment this good, this public good, this common good. It becomes a very tiny commodity. And in doing that, we are disabled to be social. And this alternative food network, I think they are doing a work of recomposing. They resist this fragmentation and they say, no, we do it differently. So, okay, counter-regulation, let me say a few things. What are they countering? Of course, they are countering the enormous exploitation. I think Vladimir is an expert, and we'll talk about that this afternoon, so I'm not saying much about it. It is countering environmental disaster. We know the contribution of agriculture to greenhouse gases, but also to biodiversity loss. And when we think of planetary boundaries, there is not only climate change that we have to worry about, it's also the biodiversity loss that agriculture contributes to, or at least the intensive form of agriculture. We are also countering a model of economy that marginalizes the small. And this is the example I always give. You know, if you raise a tomato, then and you want to produce also a tomato sauce, you can only do when you comply with certain regulation that costs a lot of money and the small farmer cannot make. So one of the groups that I talked to, for example, they are called genuine clandestine, exactly because they oppose certain form of legalization. They say, well, when this is really going against sustainability, we become clandestine and we do the thing. We occupy squares to make the markets and so on and so forth. Overall, you could see in this movement, there are some differences. Some are really keen on the small, local, and if needed, they embrace illegality. Not all of them, others operate more in legality and even supply long distance. And there is quite a debate, so far as I can understand, on the large distribution. So we have talked of supermarkets. Some really think, okay, supermarkets are the enemy. I've talked with some that say that supermarkets had approached them to sell a particular sauce, and they say, we just don't want to have anything to do with you because you are the evil, other are a bit more compromising. But I think that it's important to stress the plurality, and the diversity, but also the commonality. And if you, so these groups that I look at, they tend to have some common rules, some manifestos, which generally include respect of agroecology, food sovereignty, transparency in producing and distributing food. They also go beyond, again, this food niche. They have broader political view. They have in their documents often reference to being anti-fascist, anti-racist, anti-sexist, and so on and so forth. And I give just one example. I have 5 minutes. The participatory guarantee system, which is a very interesting one. What we call a guarantee system. They usually have a system in which people that buy the products can go to the field and see, and when they are the first time, they also go with farmers that grow similar products, so that expertise can be shared. It's really a convivial moment of trying to see, am I doing it right or not? So there is not this managerial attitude, but there is, again, a solidaristic attitude in which say we all want to get there and we want to see, and we can always see. And they are very democratic. Maybe for the Q&A, the democratic, since we are running a little bit out of time. So what they share this decommodified vision of food, but cherished markets. Sorry, didn't go. Markets are profoundly socialized. As one baker told me, the market, so when I did an interview at the market, where he was at one point, he says, well, the market is not only the market, it is a political place. They really think it's important that farmers go there, sell their products, and so on and so forth, and talk with the co-producer. So we can see that there is a shift in which market can, market conforming democracy and democracy conforming market. So these markets are institutions that well inhabit a democratic environment, that foster that, and therefore, linking back to previous, are a part and parcel of a sustainability discourse. Okay, so I mentioned Toni Morrison, but of course the first inspiration for this work was the work of Gibson Graham, in which these sociologists, they look, yes, I'm almost there, at this practice of diverse economies, and here I quote, our interest in building new worlds involves making credible those diverse practices that satisfy needs, regulate consumption, and expand the commons, so that community economies in which interdependence between people and environments is ethically negotiated can be recognized now and constructed in the future. Again, this goes to the first point. We have to see those to be able to imagine. We have to mention those practices and recognize them as possible. Of course, as lawyers, we do have additional question. It's like, how can this translate into law? And I think in a practical sense, there have been a number of shifts. Here I have some example. I just mentioned two, a proposal for a transparent price, I think was an excellent proposal, very much rejected by supermarkets. So a price in which it tells exactly who is paid what. Why is this rejected? I mean, that's clearly because you want to hide something, right? Or let's think of CAP. In the Netherlands, there is a philosopher who has endorsed this idea of limitarianism. And can we think of limitarianism, namely that we don't give any funds over a certain hectare to farmers, because we know that there is a huge problem with big farming in terms of pollution. Let's reverse it. Now, if you have a small hectare, you cannot get funds. Let's have the opposite. If it's too big, you'll get it, or you don't get more than that. So I mean, there are ideas. Are they practical? Yes, because we just heard. I mean, what markets are we talking about? It's a market that is heavily subsidized. So it's not the liberal market or the neoliberal market that we are preaching. This is a constructed market. And so let's construct it in the way we like. De-commodify, yes. Finally, this idea of recomposing knowledge. We have been mentioning the glyphosate case. So make the knowledge public. I think this is a way in which the law can help to decommodify and recompose. And I'll just close with this note. How can we accelerate the transformation? Because we are in a difficult moment. So I think one aspect that was mentioned is that there is a lot of lobbying from agro industry that is problematic. Maybe having more firewalls could help. But can we also imagine the bottom-up legal mobilization at this point, especially in this very, very tiny historical moment? And I'm thinking of an example which I really conclude. In 2017, the Umwelt Institute wrote a report saying that there were too many pesticides applied on the apples of Südtirol, you know, the nice apple. And then they were accused of defamation, and so there were criminal trials in Italy. Thanks to the criminal trials, all the records on pesticide use became public. And I don't think you want to eat an apple anymore of that region. But what I'm saying is, you know, we have the human rights perspective, but can we think of how to mobilize the law that we already have to get these values out. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alessandra. I would now like to give the word to, you can pass over. To Camilla Björkbom. She is a policy advisor for food political advisor for food policy at the Eurogroup for animals, and we'll be speaking about lobbying for animals in EU law and policy. Call up your PowerPoint.
So I can start right. Yes, I will speak about lobbying for animals. We focus on also the role of animals in sustainable food systems and the role that they shouldn't have. But first, I would like to say that animals are really at the front line of the food system. They are there as victims of a highly industrialized system, but animal welfare is also an enabler of a sustainable food system. And it is puzzling that animal welfare isn't mentioned in any of the sustainable development goals.
Sorry, just trying to share the screen again.
Yeah, that's fine. I'll just go on. This article that I'm going to show, this one, is the first one that explored the connection between animal welfare and the SDGs. And what they found was that improving animal welfare has a positive relationship to all the SDGs, but in particular to these three. Number 2, zero hunger, 12, responsible consumption and production, and number 14, life below water. And these three SDGs are, of course, highly relevant for the sustainable food system. And what they show is that you can see the green line here. That is how improving animal welfare helps us in reaching the SDGs. So you see there the correlation with SDG 2, 12, and 14 that have the strongest connection, but there are connections to all of them. So improving animal welfare can definitely help us reach the Green Deal targets. But then what does the Farm to Fork strategy say about animal welfare? And I think the Farm to Fork strategy is a really good example of making this connection. And I want us to say that this quote that I'm showing from the Farm to Fork strategy is also a very good application of the One Health principle. And I will explain a little bit more why. So first of all, it focuses on animal welfare and not only on animal health. And animal health is a part of animal welfare, but it's quite a narrow concept because it focuses on the bodily health or the absence of disease in animals, whereas animal welfare is a broader concept that also looks at the mental well-being of an animal. And this is important because, for example, there are some situations where animal health can be in opposition to animal welfare. So, for example, extreme confinement in cages can be argued that that is good animal health because the animals do not come into contact with so much pathogens. On the other hand, when you have animals that are either outdoors or that are in environments where they can perform their species-specific behaviors, so the behaviors that are important for them, then they may come into contact with more pathogens because they can move more freely, they come into contact with other animals. But just because they have a better mental well-being, a better welfare, they will be less stressed, and therefore you also need less medication. And this is very nicely captured here in the Farm to Fork strategy. And then, of course, when you have animals that are outdoor, you get other benefits in terms of preservation of biodiversity, etc. So I wanted to show this as a good example, which when we discussed also in the previous panel, One Health, so that you are also aware that there are different definitions of One Health. Then also importantly, the farm to fork strategy recognizes that this is something that is important to citizens. And despite having a successful European citizen initiative with 1.4 million citizens that signed on a demand to end the use of cages in EU animal farming, it seems now that the Commission is about to not deliver on this part of the revision of the animal welfare legislation. Just showing here also, we have a very recent Eurobarometer that confirmed the citizens' concerns for animals. So with 84% of European citizens that want to see improved welfare for farmed animals. So while the farm to fork strategy has a very good language and it was very promising when it was published, it makes this connection between animal welfare and food system sustainability. I have a hard time finding application in actual EU policy. So the one that I can show is the EU Code of Conduct, which we heard of in the first panel. And as you can see, the Code of Conduct, it does mention improved animal welfare under one of its goals in relation to sustainable production. So this is very good. But of course, the Code of Conduct is a voluntary industry initiative. So we know of the weakness of such initiatives. And it could have been, I think it could have been an important building block for the framework for a sustainable food system. But this Code of Conduct would have needed that framework to operate within, because that framework could have set minimum sustainability criteria. It could have set sustainability labeling, and also, as we talked about earlier, the restriction on marketing on low animal welfare products. So to get the worst products out of off the shelves and out of school canteens. And of course, also to ensure that the farmers who invest in higher animal welfare, that they are also rewarded by consumers and by public procurers. And I think we discussed a little bit earlier about the true costs of animal production. So this is a research that we as Eurogroup for Animals commissioned. And I think that you're aware, most people are we are well aware of the costs, the true costs, the external costs on environment, of animal production and consumption, and also on public health. So what is new with this one is that we try to monetize the cost on animal welfare, so basically animal suffering. So the gray pillar there is the total cost of animal production in the EU, and the green pillars are the environmental external costs. The blue are the public health external costs, and you see there that diet-related disease is a major part of the total true cost, and these are in billions of euros, and they look very small. So the green ones look very small comparably to the animal welfare, which is the red one. So the cost on animals is really huge of current food production. And I think that it is a problem when we do not consider animal welfare in food system sustainability. And when we don't do that, we also tend to end up in the wrong places. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what can happen if, for example, focus is too narrow on reducing greenhouse gas emissions only. Because looking only at the greenhouse gas emissions, it can make sense to have very intensive animal farming. And then we will end up with a lot of chicken farming, eggs, farmed fish. And this red pillar is mainly made up of chicken production. And that is because both the number of animals and also the amount or the level of suffering or low welfare that is within chicken production. I took some examples here just to explain a little bit more what I mean. So for example, laying hens are bred to be quite small and very feed efficient. But it's also climate friendly if they lay big eggs, so you get more output. What happens is that big eggs, when the hen are pushing them out, they commonly fracture the lower part of the keel bone. And anyone who has had a bone fracture knows this is very painful. And of course, it's nothing different in an animal. But changing this would then be considered a climate cost. The second one there, I took off from EFSA on their report on broilers and laying hens. Also there, to use fast-growing broilers, the slaughter chickens that we eat, is considered more climate friendly than using slower growing breeds. And that is because less feed is needed when you have a bird that grows fast, rather than having one that grows slower. And I also would like to mention, because there's a lot of buzz around methane reducing feed additives. And the research on those have been focusing on reducing the methane from the cow burps through different types of feed additives. This study, so the English study, they went through different types of feed additives that reduce methane. And under each of them, it says that the consequences on animal welfare are unknown or understudied. So that is also an example of how we are trying to change or adapt the animals to a system that is focused on making them produce as much as possible. And at the moment, animals are really being pushed beyond their biological limits. And in these cases, it's also, it happens in the name of climate change mitigation. And this is, of course, this is important for the animals themselves who are in these systems. But it is also important from, even if you look at it from a purely anthropocentric and human-centered perspective, because as we saw in the Farm to Fork strategy and in the studies I showed, that improving animal welfare also comes with other benefits. So these kind of things are just locking us into this system. And then I have the final three proposals. I should say rethinking the position of animals in EU law. And I start there with recognizing animal welfare and not only animal health. Animal health is a part of welfare, but when we talk about sustainability policies, the framework for a sustainable food system, or when we talk about One Health as a principle, we should recognize animal welfare and I think also mirror the Farm to Fork strategy in how, in this modern understanding, because that is also an understanding that is developing around, in animal science, that welfare is it is reducing the need for medication. So it is it's a broader and it's a concept that is related to food system sustainability. Secondly, that EU law and policy should respect the intrinsic value of animals. And I think in this audience, you are well aware of Article 13 in the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, which recognizes the intrinsic value of animals, which means that they are sentient beings and they have a value that goes beyond any use that humans have of them. But of course, that is not a legal basis. But still, respecting animals as sentient beings means also providing them with good welfare, and that goes very well hand in hand with reaching the SDGs. And it's even can be an enabler to help us reach the Greenfield targets. And then finally, paying attention to animal welfare can provide policy guidance. Now, I don't know if I talked enough about that, but what I wanted to say with this is that if we consider animal welfare in this broader sense, it can give us guidance. So if we think about, okay, should we use these methane reducing feed? Yes or no? But maybe we shouldn't if we don't have conclusive evidence that they do not affect animals in a bad way. And sometimes they are even for use only for indoor systems. And that would contradict the environmental benefits we can have from animals that are outdoors. I think insect farming for feeding pigs and chickens is also such a question where we can get some guidance by considering animal welfare. So we don't have to end up in taking the wrong decisions that locks us into a very intensive system. So I think I'll end with that.
With that selfie refresher, I'd like to introduce Elisabet Nadeu, who is an environmental scientist and senior policy analyst at the Institute for European Environmental Policy, and she will be speaking about nature restoration for resilient food systems. We'll get about you can really see that I'm not accustomed to Windows computers. It's this.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to this panel today. And I'm going to talk about nature restoration and why we need it for resilient and sustainable food systems. So I'm going to take a bit of a different angle. Here I'm an environmental scientist. I'm not really so much a policy person or a law person, so I'll do my best to adapt. And so just very briefly on the organization where I'm working, the Institute for European Environmental Policy. We are a think tank based in Brussels, and we work with a wide range of stakeholders all across the EU to provide evidence-based research that informs policymaking for environmental policies in the EU. And I'm personally working at the agriculture and food team, but we have different teams within the institute that are focusing on all areas of the European Green Deal. So today we have talked a lot already about food systems, also a little bit about agriculture, but definitely one of the pillars of any food system or sustainable food system is food production. So if we don't produce food, we don't have anything to discuss. And our food production depends on healthy ecosystems. So these ecosystems are providing direct services to the agricultural sector, such as productive soils, crop pollination, control of pests and diseases, nutrient carbon cycling, and you could name many more of them. But they also provide indirect services by reducing the negative impacts of extreme weather events and also increasing the resilience of the system. However, it's not going to come as big news to you. Our ecosystems are not in a very healthy state in the EU. And if we look specifically at agricultural land and just focusing on two aspects, biodiversity and soil degradation, we see, for instance, that in terms of biodiversity, 60% of species and 70% of the habitats that are protected by the EU Habitats Directive are found in an unfavorable conservation status, which is very worrying. But also very worrying is the state of our soils, and soils are essential components of agroecosystems. 95% of the food that we eat comes directly or indirectly from soils, and soil degradation is now affecting between 60 and 70% of EU agricultural soils. This is not only important because of the state in which these ecosystems are found, but because it leads also to large economic and productivity losses, and in the end, it threatens our capacity to produce food. So more good news on top of that, the pressure is mounting, exacerbated by climate change. We are facing increased droughts, so you're probably well aware of what happened over the past couple of years. EU crop losses to droughts are therefore rising. And member states have reported up to several billion euros in losses just over the past 2 years to droughts. There's also other extreme events and perturbations that are affecting our agricultural sector, such as floods, storms, wildfires, and pest and disease outbreaks. So what are the responses that we can give to these challenges? Well, the European Commission at the moment, one of the ones that has given, at least for this year, is to use the agricultural reserve, just to be called the crisis reserve, to help farmers face these economic losses derived from droughts. But clearly, if the situations are going to increase in the future, this is not a sustainable option. So what else can we do? You probably guessed it already. We can restore nature. Nature restoration, according to the Commission, is a process to support the recovery of degraded, damaged, or destroyed ecosystems and bring more nature and biodiversity back. And this makes sense not only in ecologic terms, but also economic ones, because every euro spent on restoration delivers a return on investment between 8 and 38 euros. This is taken from the impact assessment of the nature restoration law. So just in practical, what this means, for instance, for agriculture, we can restore nature through a set of practices, you could say agroecology in general, but we can diversify crops, we can introduce landscape features to increase biodiversity, we can apply practices that reduce soil disturbance, and we can also reduce or even eliminate the need for synthetic external inputs. And the type of benefits that we get, and this is what again gets monetized to try to quantify what the economic benefits of nature restoration is bringing to the different sectors. For instance, if we increase soil organic matter, we are increasing the capacity of soils to retain water. And this helps our resilience against droughts, but also against floods. And the same for biodiversity. If we increase biodiversity in agricultural landscapes, we also improve the biological control of pests and diseases. So the good news is that in the EU, we will soon have, probably, most likely, an EU nature restoration law. And the proposal was published by the Commission in June 2022. And this was a response to a commitment made in the EU biodiversity strategy to 2030 to adopt legally binding targets for nature restoration. This is very important because it's the first time that there's going to be a legislative instrument that is setting EU level and binding targets for nature restoration. And these targets and obligations will span across a broad range of ecosystems, both at land and at sea, but also include agricultural areas. So the overall objective of the law will be to put in place restoration measures that cover at least 20% of the Union's land and sea areas by 2030, and all of the ecosystems in need of restoration by 2050. However, the journey to here has not been easy. This proposal has been the subject of a misinformation campaign. There was fierce opposition by several groups at the European Parliament, also from part of the agricultural lobbies. But at the same time, it received large unprecedented support from society. So over 1 million citizens, businesses, scientists, and other stakeholders backed the proposal, the law. So finally, after a very long process, there was an agreement reached last week in the third trilogue between the Council, the Parliament, and the Commission on the final text. And so the proposal is now at a stage where we are just waiting for the member state endorsement, final vote in the Council and in the Parliament. Of course, because it's been a bumpy road, we have lost a lot of things along the way. And I think this is important because we have been talking a lot today about getting a new legislation on board, and of course, it's in the end there's a need for a dialogue, there's compromises to move forward, and in this case we will have most likely a law, but we have left some things along the way. And if we focus, for instance, in Article 9, which is the one that is devoted to agricultural land, we have gone, for instance, from a results-based approach to the improvement of specific indicators to an efforts-based approach, which is much weaker. So, for instance, the initial text read, we have to achieve, well, member states will have to achieve an increasing trend for these three indicators: the Grassland Butterfly Index, the share of agricultural land with high diversity landscape features, and the stock of organic carbon in crop mineral soil. This was initially in the text, and now the agreement last week, the text reads as well, member states will have to put in place measures which shall aim to improve two of these three indicators. So unless there's a big control, well, things could happen or things could not happen. So just to show a bit how some other policies can be undermined along the way. There's also been the introduction of this emergency brake option that would suspend the implementation of the law for the agricultural ecosystems as well in the event of exceptional events outside of EU's control. So just to close, some final thoughts. We need long-term structural solutions to respond to these external pressures and trends so that we can ensure that we have sustainable food systems in place, and in particular, sustainable food production. And nature restoration in agroecosystems can have multiple benefits, but there's been very little progress over the past decade, and this is probably a part of it is because there were no obligations, so everything was based on voluntary commitments, which has not, well, they have not gotten us where we should be today. And so finally, the nature restoration law could trigger action, so we're positive about that, but the final text leaves ample interpretation on flexibility for its implementation. And just one final thing, maybe also on the funding, so that's maybe a question, in case the question came up, because of course, who will be paying for this nature restoration? And the European Commission now will have 1 year to come up with a report mentioning the different possible funding sources as well as potential funding gaps. But in principle, the common agricultural policy, for instance, will not have to change its funding allocations to implement any of these objectives at the moment. So that's it for me.
Well within the time limits. Thank you very much for that. Then before we move on to the general Q&A, one final speaker, Anniek, who is a professor in health law and policy here at the University of Amsterdam. In the environment, yeah. Yes.
Okay, so I'm very happy to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me. I'm back in my old habitat, as they say, because I used to be. I'm still in the I'm still part. I feel still part of, or still a member of the ACELG group, but in the meantime, we've also started our own group, which is called the Law Center for Health and Life. And one of the things that I would like to report on today is a research that we did that talks about food choice as an environmental factor. And so actually it's part of research that has been done in two parts. The first part was in 2001, was part of the city deal in the Netherlands with 5 cities that asked us to do this kind of research. And this is the group that we did this with. People from Wageningen, people from the Amsterdam Medical Center, and the law group. So one of the questions or the driving questions for our center is really, how can law improve health? And in this case, it's the question that the cities ask us is, how can we use environmental law to regulate for health and sustainable diets? Now, if we listen to Professor De Schutter this morning, one of the first things that he mentions is that the current food system, if we look at food as a system, or the food system as a whole, is that the way that it's currently configured creates very much unhealthy diets in people, rising obesity. And if we look at the food system, we see a changing landscape in urban settings. So we've talked a lot about the beginning of the supply chain. Now I'm talking a little bit about the end of the supply chain, but of course this feeds into the kind of food that is being produced on a day-to-day basis. So what we see over the last 10 years is there's a diminished supply of unprocessed offerings. So a lot of the food offerings in our neighborhoods have been replaced by supermarkets, by home delivery, by takeout, by fast food. So in the Netherlands, for instance, in the last decennium, there's a 120% increase of takeout and delivery, 34% increase in restaurants. And then there's a 24% diminishing establishment offering unprocessed foods. So what does this mean? Currently, our supermarket supply all the food that you see in the supermarket is almost 80% unhealthy, not in the what we call the schijf van 5 in the Netherlands. And so that means if you can basically find your healthy foods when you walk into the supermarket, when there's fresh fruits and vegetables, and when you stay at the outer ring of the supermarket, which is where the fresh food is being offered. As soon as you go inside of the supermarket, which is the largest part of it, it's all processed food. Then food advertising is targeting, or 85% of it is targeting unhealthy foods towards consumers. And I don't know what that was. And then out-of-home eating is also 91% unhealthy. So everything from thuisbezorgd or takeaways, etc. It's all processed foods. What do we see? What is the impact of this? So in 2022, there was a report of the WHO on obesity in the European Union. We see now that there's such a rise in obesity and overweight. That 1 in 3 children in the EU is overweight, 1 in 4 adolescents, and 60% of adults. So more than 50% of people are at an unhealthy weight. What happens then? We get an increase in obesity, means an increase in type 2 diabetes, which is very expensive also for the system, for our social systems, cardiovascular disease, cancer. So these are the 3 main diseases that we call NCDs, non-communicable diseases, so non-infectious diseases. This shortens the life expectancy of people up to 10 years and really increases inequalities and inequities in health, because a lot of this is also related to socioeconomic circumstances that people live in. So there's 4 levers for solution, at least in the field of health, or so not in the beginning of the supply chain, but at the end of the supply chain. We can look at the price of food. At what price is food being offered to consumers? We can talk about taste. So what kind of ingredients are put into food that means that people keep on eating? So sugar, fat, but also all kinds of chemicals. Advertising, so how is food being advertised? And the food environment. So this is the environments in which we live in. And that was the focus for the research that we did. So what do we mean by food environment? We mean the availability, the affordability, the convenience, the promotion, the quality, sustainability of food and beverages in wild, cultivated and built spaces that are influenced by the social, cultural, political environment and ecosystems within which they are embedded. One of the main things that we looked at was the urban setting, so the built spaces. And in the built spaces, food is everywhere. And food is everywhere. That means you walk from the station, you walk from your street. There's no place where there's no food. When you want to go to your hardware store to get nails or a hammer, there will be a Mars or a Snickers bar at the register. There are no spaces where there's no food offerings anymore. And we started out with the research saying this is a public responsibility, right? We have the Lancet Commission on Obesity. We have the Time to Deliver report. Everywhere, every time countries are agreeing, they must take responsibility for the delivery on agreed outputs and outcomes as stated in endorsed documents. So there's many documents where countries have committed themselves to doing something about this. We see constitutional provisions on health in the Netherlands. We certainly have an Article 11, but also international obligations. Also, we have the precautionary principle. So there's a preponderance, once there is a preponderance of evidence, there's a clear need of protection, countries need to take action, the EU needs to take action. But why is this not happening? What we found in our first research is that despite all of these obligations, in order to take action at state or municipal level, environmental law is a legal means by which to do it. So you need to have planning, zoning laws, these kinds of laws. You need to change them in order to change the food offerings within a particular built environment. So that means that we need to so environmental laws need to start seeing the food offerings in a particular environment as spatial. And so the way that we've seen food consumption is that it's a matter of consumer choice. You walk through your street, you decide to go into the cafe or into the snack bar, and you purchase your French fries, right? This is an individual choice. But what if your environment is so polluted with food offerings that you don't really have a choice anymore? Under what circumstances can we see the food offerings as similar to, say, unhealthy air that we breathe? So environmental law regulates the space between you as a citizen and your environment. And the environment is pushed upon you. You have no choice. So you live close to an agricultural land. There are diseases that are sort of spread through the land, which has happened in the Netherlands many times. Now we have an environmental issue. The state needs to step in because you as a citizen have no choice but to undergo this situation. So it regulates the space between the citizen and the environment. Whereas with food, it's an individual choice. No one is telling you to buy that, I don't know, the kroketje in the Netherlands or the bitterbal, right? So it regulates the space between, environmental law regulates the space between the space and the citizen. So what can be done in health law is always based on individual choice. It can be the government's prevention campaigns, it can be voluntary cooperation of companies, it can be about giving information or trying to reduce certain marketing budgets of companies, but it's all based on individual choice. And in health, autonomy is majorly important. So there's one case, for instance, on Jehovah's Witnesses that says of the ECHR, it says patients must have the right to make choices to accord with their own views and values, regardless of how, and this is of course the phrase, irrational, unwise, or imprudent such choices may appear to others. And this means if you want to choose to eat the French fries or eat the bitterbal, this is your individual choice. There is no obligation to stay healthy. You can become unhealthy if this is what you want to do. And this is quite important, I would say, to also keep protecting that right. But what choice is there if there's such limited foods available? Now, what we did is we measured the food environment. If we're going to make the food environment spatial, we need to measure it the same way that we would measure the air, like the air quality in a particular neighborhood. So what we did is we used existing and available data that is online. This is called the locatus data that companies actually use to think about where do they want to start their new company, or like where, so for instance, McDonald's, if they see, okay, in Leiden, there's only 2 McDonald's, we could probably add one. They use locatus data to see where they can put their company. We use that data and we created heat maps of particular neighborhoods. And then we used an existing study that says like a baker is 3, quite healthy, maybe a vegetable store is 5, very healthy. A snack bar is -2, very unhealthy. So there's a Delphi study that is done with a lot of health sciences people that have done this study. So they have kind of already made an outline of what stores are how unhealthy or healthy. So we used the data that we got, and we basically assigned healthy or unhealthy to each of the offerings in that neighborhood. And then we walked through the neighborhood with a bunch of students, and we actually counted the food that was available in the street. Because to what extent does the data that we got relate to what is actually being offered in the street? That's not always the same. And so we measured a street here, very close by, the Eerste Oosterparkstraat, that the city of Amsterdam said has been very unhealthy in a very short time. And we measured how healthy is that street based on the online data and on what the students were counting. And students actually made pictures of everything that was offered, and also, anyway, it was a big, but it was fun. Anyway, so we did that. And so we measured the food environment on the Eerste Oosterparkstraat. And so 78% of the offerings in the Eerste Oosterparkstraat are unhealthy. What this research did is that we can actually measure the food environment, and we can make a heat map of neighborhoods that is accurate. Because what we now saw with this research was that we have the online data, that corresponds quite well with what is being offered in the street. So from a city planning, from a municipal planning perspective, it is important that they don't need to have people walking around in the street doing the kind of work that the students did, right? Because it's very hard to regulate it. But now we know that the online data that we got actually corresponds with what is offered in the street. That means that theoretically, we can now regulate towards more neutral food zones, where there is actually both healthy and unhealthy offerings in that neighborhood. Yet there is a legal obstacle, which is EU law. So EU law, for instance, the Services Directive, makes it very hard for cities to actually not give them a, I'm trying to find the vergunning, which is a word for the license, a permit for offering food in a particular neighborhood. So if you want to start your business, it's the Services Directive really makes it hard for cities to say, no, you can't do this based on the kind of policy that we see here. So cities are very, very reluctant to start doing this. They're very worried about litigation. The other political obstacle, so not a legal obstacle, is the planning law and the planning politics in the Netherlands. So planning lawyers, I didn't know there was this whole culture, but there's a whole culture. They really don't like to add something like this that is very contentious into their other means of, or their other ways of zoning laws and planning laws. So that's very hard for cities. So the planning law lawyers are saying, no, cities, please don't do this. So what we're gonna do, and right now there's 9 cities in the Netherlands that are figuring out if they want to try it, but for research purposes, what we want to try to do is further generalize the way that we've measured the food environment now into different other cities and areas, so zoning areas, and experiment with new kinds of regulations in local settings, and of course, measure the health outcomes over time. So to what extent will this kind of, if we can change the policies and the laws in a particular area, will this actually lead to better health outcomes over time? Now we've seen that in Gateshead, there's one place in the in Europe that where this worked. So in Gateshead was a relatively small area. They were able to limit fast food based on an immense amount of obesity among children there. And within a 4-year period of time, they saw that there were a lot of health improvement in their local community. What can we expect from the EU? Well, I think that within the survey, it would be good if there was some kind of EU guidance for municipalities that are wanting to try to do this, because this is a huge problem all over Europe, is to think about how can we give some guidance for the application of the Services Directive. And of course, for policymakers, it's very important to decide what level of healthy or unhealthy foods available in an environment do we say impairs a healthy choice, right? So we put it on 50%. So we said we need neutral food environments. But of course, this is very political. You might say within a school zone, it needs to be on 80% healthy food offerings because of further protections. Or around stations or around in the center of the city, we might say, you know, it's okay if here the food environment is 60 to 80% unhealthy. So these are some of the contentious issues still in place.